What's the coaming height in the cockpit? Coaming mean the height of the boat on the inside of the cockpit. There are some saltwater boats, let alone freshwater boats, 24 inches. I'm 6'3", or I used to be. Yeah, gravity has its way with you after a while. Look at the difference between 24, 26, and 28 inches on your leg sometime. If it's 30 inches, that becomes the fulcrum that is keeping you on the boat or letting you fall overboard. The higher it is, the more safe it is. And the other thing to look at besides railing height, is there a toe kick space, which is created either by an actual toe kick at floor level or by having the railing of the boat stick out further than your liner on the inside. Then you can stand upright with your thigh against the railing, but your toe is in.
Yep.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, the extra indent.
So it makes a huge difference in your balance.
Unless you have a size 16 shoe, then you're kind of...
Yeah. Or huge thighs, I guess, one or the other.
You're listening to the Rising Tidecast, the podcast for sharing the stories, the lessons, and all the good stuff from legends in the marine industry. Welcome to another episode of the Rising Tidecast. Today, I'm very stoked to have Eric Sorensen back on for round 2 of the podcast. This time in person. We're what seems to be your holy ground at Ray Hunt Design in Massachusetts.
Right.
Welcome, Eric.
It's excellent to be back with you again, Steve. It was a lot of fun last time. And of course, we've done a lot of this on the water too in Australia. So it's great.
On episode 6, that episode got a whole lot of love. And we dug into like your background, your time in the Coast Guard, your book, your work in the industry, and you shared a lot about insights about boat design and handling. And so if anyone hasn't heard that one yet, definitely worth a listen. And you'll understand after listening, I think, why your words carry so much weight from your experience in the industry. I know a few things have changed since we last spoke. So I'd love to start with like what you're up to, what day-to-day work looks like for you now.
Right. Well, I work with boat builders, basically improving concepts. It's great to do it in the design phase because it's really easy to make the necessary changes while the boat's still a bunch of electrons, rather than after it's out there and not performing the way you want it to. I've developed a lot more interest back to my roots really with the Coast Guard. And I've been talking to some folks there about, doing some work with them and also the Navy. So I have both a Coast Guard background as a coxswain and a surfman. I was a first-class boatswain mate in my early years. And then I was in the Navy as a ship driver, as a commissioned officer. Both great experiences, and they've informed what I'm doing today. So it's great to be back here at Hunt too, Ray Hunt Design in New Bedford. And I just want to mention an anecdote. Tom Pilkington has been a longtime hunt dealer in Connecticut and a great guy, boat dealer. And one of the dealers that really knows the product, who really knows how to run them and design and everything else. And I remember Tom coming in here once in a design we were working on together. And he said it was like walking into a church when he came in the front door because it's all the Hunt memorabilia going back to the 50s, with Ray Hunt. And so,
oh man, it's plastered everywhere here.
It is.
It's very cool to see because, you talk about how great a hull can be and the impact of it. And we talk about how the things that they should know. But then when you look here and you look on the wall of like all the parts of the industry that they've touched and all the successes that they had, it's literally plastered all over the wall here.
Yeah.
It is like do your cross as you enter
you genuflect on your way through the door, But anyway, when Tom said that, I thought, well, he's right. It really is.
Yeah. You paused for a while in the lobby when you came.
Yeah, I just, I do my ablations and when I walk in,
So that's really interesting, though. I think that you're working in the commercial sector with like Coast Guard and stuff. So what does that look like? And being very different from the, pleasure craft, personal watercraft kind of side of things, like when they do a build, I'm really interested in what the process of like the RFP looks like. And then what are some of those things that you lean on in your knowledge and skill set to build one of those?
It's a good topic too, because, I've been doing this for a long time, between operating the boats a lot and then the last 25 years operating as well as being involved with the engineering and the design, because I can synthesize all that with my background. But what the Coast Guard and the Navy basically do, I think the government in general, is they'll send out a request for information, who out there can build this new 80-footer that we want to come out with here in a few years. And then they get everybody's responses, and then they send out a request for proposal. And I'm really simplifying the process, but request for proposal, okay, who could build this boat now? And they specify, they'll say it's got to be 80 feet long and 20 feet wide and go 30 knots for 10 hours and carry 25 people. I know the basic specifications. And this is also based on my experience running the boats as a 17-year-old when I was first joined the Coast Guard. I knew how to drive boats before I went out. I spent the whole 8 years old on running boats and being aboard them. But I didn't look at boats critically in those days. Like the 44 motor lifeboat that we had in those days at both Hatteras and Hampshire, where I was, and then also different stations on Cape Cod. I just ran the boats. I didn't say, well, it'd really be better if the throttle was 4 inches to the right and the steering wheel was at this angle and I can't really see because of that windshield frame. But now that's what I do. I not only run the boats, but I look at them very critically. So it's, for me, it's coming full circle. If I'm able to work with the Coast Guard, it would be kind of a homecoming for me because I used to run the boats. I feel an emotional connection and maybe a bond even to the crews. And when I go out with the Coast Guard crews these days, I think a lot more than I say, you know, when I look at the boats and things that I would do differently on them. But I also feel like it would be wonderful to be able to contribute to our crews having the optimal boats, you know, best in every way. They're great boats as they are, but there are areas where, you know, things could be tweaked a little bit.
Right.
There are also a lot of people that are doing a really good job, what I call the art of the possible in boat design. And so there are real boats out there that are doing these certain things very well, whether you're talking about the Coast Guard or, you know, a yacht company, it doesn't really matter, or somebody that makes commercial fishing boats. There are fishing boats and yachts and commercial boats, the military boats that are doing certain things very well. And if you can synthesize all that and you put it all into one package and you can specify what those elements are. I'll give you an example. While the length of a boat may be specified or what sea state it can operate in, we don't often talk about the arc of visibility. You know, how much of the horizon can you see from your seated helm position when you're driving the boat? And not only how much of the horizon can you see out of 360 degrees, but how wide are the windshield frames or mullions? And how much of that horizon does it block? Is it 2 degrees? Is it 5 degrees? Is it 7 degrees? Right. And then is it in the giveaway sector, which is dead ahead to 2 points abaft the beam? You know, which that's, you're the giveaway vessel. You have to give way to anybody coming from that bearing. So, which is particularly important. So it's important to quantify that and not just say, oh, visibility is pretty good. And then how about those cup holders, you know?
Yeah, that's
They'd
right.
be able to quantify and say, well, I can, out of 360 degrees, I can see 335, which
Right.
is better than 310.
Yeah. So is that not generally then a specification that would be in those RFPs?
From what I can see, the RFPs don't get into, and I've just talked about general RFPs. In my experience, it doesn't matter the service or the agency, and same thing goes for government or military commercial specifications. They don't get into enough detail in things that I think matter as a boat driver, you know, like the arc of visibility. What about the layout of the helm? There are boats you get in, commercial boats that you get in and you just think, what in the world is going on here? I got the steering wheel up here and the throttles are over here.
We saw a few of them at the day boats in the harbor yesterday.
We did.
Yeah.
We did.
Amazing that they can see out of the helm most of the time.
Yeah, well, in New Bedford, the fishing boat, some are actually pretty good. Some of the newer designs, you know, the visibility. And I don't want to, you know, get bogged down but it's so important to be able to see where you're going, because what does that drive? It drives or determines is, first of all, situational awareness. Can you see what's around you? Because it's really important to avoid collision.
Yes.
You know, and there's something in the Navy we called CBDR, constant bearing decreasing range, which means somebody's coming right at you from a certain bearing. So if you've got a CBDR at night, especially when you only have running lights to look at, and they're right behind that 7-inch wide corner post or window frame, and they stay on that bearing, you're going to reach out and say good evening to them before you ever see them. So it's really important that these arcs of visibility are constrained. You know, you have really good visibility. That impacts, to use that word sort of cynically here, you know, avoiding collision.
Yeah. The importance you put on that, where maybe the person that is building the boat or the government team or a pleasure craft company, like they wouldn't maybe go to that fine detail of like, we need the degree, right? We need this. What does that come down to for you? Like how you see things like that playing such a bigger role in the overall boat design?
There is often, not always, but often a disconnect between a very experienced boat driver, a coxswain in the Coast Guard, or a captain in the commercial service or the pleasure world, somebody who really knows how to run a boat. They understand piloting, they understand navigation, seamanship, but they might not even think about that. They might say, well, this is like I did when I was a kid, when I was driving the Coast Guard boats or a charter boat. Just the way it is. You got a 7-inch wide frame and you can't see through it. But if you understand engineering and boat driving, the two together, then you say, wait a minute, this could be done better. I'll give you another example. Responsiveness to the engines at low speed. I've been on a lot of boats where you put the engine in gear and not much happens. And it doesn't happen until you give it a lot of throttle. And why is that? Well, often this is because the propellers are too small in diameter. You know, I talk about traction, which is a very non-nautical term, unnautical term perhaps.
Yep.
But it really synopsizes what you're looking for. When you put the engines in gear, the boat should move now without throttle. it should immediately start moving. Or if you twist them, one engine ahead, one engine astern, with or without rudder assisting, you should immediately get some authority and you should start twisting on your pivot point, the pivot point of the boat. And if that doesn't happen, then the builder might say, and I've seen this with pleasure boat builders, well, I want it to go 35 knots and I can't use big props because I want to go 35 knots because the marketing people say we got to have that number in our hip pocket. But then I look at a company like Viking Yachts, which builds more sport fishing boats than I think probably everybody combined in the world. Some of those Vikings go over 40 knots, 45 miles an hour. They walk away from most outboards at cruise. You think about, an outboard will go 50 miles an hour. Well, so will Viking.
Yeah, it's
and
wild.
Viking will do it at cruise all day long at 2,000 RPM or whatever the number is.
Yep.
So why is that? Well, not only will that Viking do 40 knots or plus, and we're talking about 70, 80 footers, but when you see when maneuvering in the marina, which is what everybody can do if they have interest, they put the boat driver puts one engine in gear, the boat moves instantly, and the transom jumps because of the power. So if you say, well, I can't have low-speed maneuverability, which in the military they call station keeping, like in the surf, or if you're towing a boat, anything where you need a lot of bollard pull, you need a lot of low-speed power and responsiveness. Look at Viking Yachts. They've got a boat go 40 knots, and when you put one engine in gear, the stern actually rises out of the water a little bit.
Everybody on board definitely knows when you are in gear.
If you put both engines in gear at the same time, you fall over.
Yeah.
If the crew is not ready for it, you're not prepared for it. So you put both engines in gear at a time on one of these sport fishing boats, on the Viking in particular. Why is that? Well, they have to maneuver around fish. They want to catch a marlin. They got to keep the stern pointed in the direction the line is going, or they want to back down. That's what I say. That is the art of the possible. It's not some fairy tale that you're trying to achieve. Who's best in class in these different areas? You look at boats like some of these Norse boats, Swedish or Finnish boats, that have great visibility from the pilot house. It's all glass across the front. Beautiful. Okay, well, now we know that's possible. So let's make that Axopar or whatever the brand is, Nimbus, visibility our standard, because they're already doing it. And they figured out the engineering.
Yeah.
Boats don't fall apart. The pilot house doesn't fall off in a seaway. You know what I mean? Hey, well, it's possible, guys.
Yes. Yeah.
So Viking maneuverability and a lot of their engineering is fantastic.
It sounds like from your interest in wide experience in different parts of the industry allows you to see those things that maybe most people wouldn't think are possible because you have, set foot and had experience in all those different sectors and interested in the things that we don't always look at.
Exactly. One of the guys here at Hunt has a, do what you love what you do on his desk. In fact, the guy that does the pilot boats here, Bob Provincial. And I've been very fortunate because I love boats. I've loved boats since I was 8 years old, and I've been able to make my living on them in the Coast Guard, the Navy, and then in my business and my consulting work all these years. What I've done differently, I suppose, a little bit is to do an analysis of different competitor models. So we'd pick like 6 boats from, 8 different, 5, 6, 7 different brands. And I ran them. I ran every one of them. And I thought, wow, there is a lot to talk about here. So what I did is I do PowerPoints and some video walkthroughs, but mostly PowerPoints on all these boats. And you have a picture, or I take videos of the boats going down sea or whatever. And what that did is it forced me to look closely at the boats and do the analysis. And when you have to juxtapose one boat against another, or for powerboat reports, when I first retired from the Navy, I do 2 or 3-way comparisons. And it forces you to look, why is this boat better? Why does it handle better? Why does this boat hook going down sea? In other words, why does this stern spin out? It took me a while to figure that out.
I think, too, a big part of that is not just listing those elements or the measurements. It's the same thing in marketing, is how do you relate that point of difference to someone's experience, and how do you tell that story? Like, yes, okay, the 8-inch versus 6-inch cleat, that's good to know. And then how do you tell the story, or how do you relate that to like the real owner use case?
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, it's not just an academic point on that, say the 8-inch versus 6-inch cleat. Most boats in that size are using 1/2-inch lines. And if you try to tie 1/2-inch line with a round turn and a full figure 8 and a weather hitch, which is the way you should tie a line off to a cleat, you can barely fit it on a 6-inch cleat. So there's no room left to tie another line onto. So it's a very practical. It's not just, it's 8-inch. 8-inch is better than 6-inch. It's why it's better. Because in a practical application using a 1/2-inch line, the typical line used on a 25-foot boat, say, this is why it matters. Because you can put a round turn, figure 8, and a weather hitch on it comfortably without it falling off.
So thinking about that and all the small things that are actually the big things, what are some of those things that you took from all the experience on the Coast Guard, Navy boats that you brought back into the important or the focus in the pleasure boat industry? I think there's a lot to learn, right?
There's a lot to learn, and sometimes on both sides.
Yeah.
Take the Viking transmissions and drivetrains, for example, which are the best I've ever seen. On the military side, here's a story I used to tell. I was on 4 different warships when I was in the Coast Guard. And let's just pick Briscoe. It's a 563-foot, 8,200-ton destroyer. I was an officer at the deck, so I drove the ship, right? Alongside oilers in the dark with tuna boats all around. What you learn then is how important visibility is. And here's the story I tell, is I could stand at the coffee machine on the Briscoe, 8,000-ton destroyer, which is on the aft bulkhead of the bridge. And then it was probably, 16 or 18 feet forward to the windshield. Okay, and I could see a set of running lights easily at 10,000 yards, which is 5 nautical miles. And I could not do that on a pleasure boat. Well, first, part of it's height of eye. We're 55 feet off the water, height of eye. But also, there's zero glare in the windows. And that's a function of 2 things fundamentally. One is the windshield on a destroyer or most commercial boats slope forward. Nothing above them. There's no lights and there's no bright white painted or fabric overhead to reflect off the window. So you have a reflection-free window, which at night makes all the difference. Like I said, I could stand at the coffee machine and look 15 or so feet forward through a window and see a running light at 4 or 5 or 6 miles away. So that stuck with me because you can't do that on most pleasure boats. The other thing, besides the forward swept windshield, which I think is a great idea even for a pleasure boat, but I fully understand the aesthetics of having the aft sloping windshield. But what you can do to mitigate the reflection problem with a aft sloping windshield, like most pleasure boats have today, although that trend is changing, is you can watch the fabrics that you can use. So you get in your car and you look at the fabric or the material that's directly under the windshield in your Volkswagen or your Ford or your Chevy pickup, whatever you're driving. It's a material that does not reflect light. So you can see through that windshield at night, which is pretty important when you're driving at night, going 70 miles an hour down the highway.
That's right.
Right? But I'll tell you what you do. What I tell people is take a sheet of white paper out of your notebook or get a sheet of white paper and put it on the dash on your car at night and see what happens. You can barely see through that part of the windshield that's above that piece of paper. Back to your question about what I learned in the military, the Coast Guard and Navy, the colors should be dark and they should be muted. They should be flat versus glossy, like flat paint and glossy paint. You don't want glossy paint on your bridge. No. You especially don't want it in the what we call the ceiling in a boat or with the overhead, right, on a ship. So on a Navy destroyer, it's flat black. It's the best possible color.
Right.
So not only do you have the forward sloping windshield, but you got the flat black, which wouldn't reflect anyway. And then the bulkheads, the walls on a ship are called bulkheads, right? They're all, on a Navy ship anyway, they're pea green and flat. So the Navy has a little bit of a concession there to aesthetics. The whole bridge isn't black, but it's dark. It's flat pea green. So that's one thing that's
a big one, though.
It's a huge one because without situational awareness all the way around, you can have a collision really easily. Why do you want to live with that added chance? I mean, it's all about odds, right?
Yeah.
But if you can see that boat coming at you, or that ship coming at you, or that lighthouse over there, you can see it better, then you have much more situational awareness, and the odds or the chances of you having a bad day are greatly diminished.
I think you've talked about them before as stressors, right? That contribute to fatigue while you're driving or just not a great experience while you're out on the water. If you could pick maybe 3 to 5 of those things that you think are the biggest contributors or alleviators of those stressors, what would those be?
I refer to that, and it's not my original term, but as workload. So workload is really important, whether you're working or you're driving your yacht. It doesn't make any difference if you're driving a yacht or a commercial boat or a Coast Guard boat or a Navy ship. There is physical workload, and that's the physical effort that it takes to withstand the motions that you're subjected to. So the motions are a function of the vessel's hull shape, displacement, as opposed to the waves that it's riding through. So a big ship, little waves, there's no stressors physically, really. But little boat, big waves, there's a lot of physical stress. And so your body is constantly adjusting and your muscles are constantly being used to keep you upright and stable. And
many days out, I've come back extremely sore holding a cat.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how well the boat rides. I think you're still copping it.
So there's this bell curve, if you will, a boat that runs really poorly or really well. And we will talk about Deadrise distribution later, for example, but how smoothly that boat runs through the water, the accelerations that your body, the boat, and then your body are subjected to makes a great deal of difference in your comfort, but also how prone you are to injury. So if you're out there in a boat that has the bow is too full and too flat, and the dead rise doesn't continue far enough aft for its speed, you're going to get beat up. And that can translate into injuries really easily, especially if you're, say, a Navy boat crew and you have to go out there and take the SEALs into an insertion point so they can do their mission, and you got to go 50 miles an hour, come hell or high water, then you're going to get beat up a lot. And a lot of those boat crews, small boat crews, end up with injuries, and they're disabled, according to the Veterans Administration, physically, because of the injuries they're subjected to. But many times, it's really completely unavoidable. I wouldn't say always, because maybe there's some missions where they just got to go, they're going to lose lives, okay? But usually, if you have a boat that runs better, you're not going to be subjected to those there's average accelerations, RMS accelerations, and there's peak accelerations. If you can keep both down, your chances of injury or sustained over time are going to be greatly diminished. So that's one thing that I look at in terms of workload. Another one is if you, back to you can't see out of the boat. I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but if you can't see out of the boat, you're going to be more highly stressed. There are boats that you can't see out of at all, really, from the pilot house. Unless you're stupid, you're going to be on edge because you can't see in these huge arcs of visibility. So your psychological stress goes up. So we've talked about physiological, now we're talking about psychological. And then there is the emotions if the ergonomics at the helm are poor. They say, well, this boat is so bad, it's like putting the windshield wiper switch in your car in the glove box.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's analogous to that.
It is. You have to have you stretch Armstrong to get there.
Yeah, it's crazy. And you think, well, the engineers that designed these boats never run them.
Right.
They couldn't run them, or they wouldn't be putting the windshield wiper switch in the glove box. So there are different things that contribute to workload. If you want to have a happy crew, your employer, you want somebody to run your boat for you, why don't you want them to have low stress? Now pay attention, because lots of stuff can happen real quickly out on the water, no matter where you are. But you want them to be comfortable and secure, and all these workload factors tamed as much as possible. So it increases the safety of the crew, the well-being, the mission accomplishment, whether it's going out and towing somebody in or boarding them, a law enforcement role. When I go aboard boats all the time, I wonder, why did they put that over there? Why didn't they line the steering wheel and the throttles up, the engine controls? And that is another thing. You can arrange poorly the location of the throttles, the engine controls, and the wheel. And not only the location, but the orientation, the angle of the wheel, the angle of the throttle. So if the angle is too steep, like you see in a lot of boats, what are you doing? You're using your forearm to make fine motor control adjustments to the throttles. You want to go up 100 RPM. You want to go up to 300 RPM. But if you're using your triceps, because now the throttle is more aligned with your bicep and tricep at the right height and at the right angle, generally around 20 degrees, something like that, and the throttles and the wheel are next to each other, and not like this or like this, then not only is it more comfortable and you can control the boat more capably and you can fine-tune the control better, but if your spine is misaligned because of the wheel and the engine control position and attitude and orientation, it can also actually cause spinal injuries over time. So it matters in a lot of ways you might not think about at first glance.
You did mention Deadrise, working with Short Marine and other dealerships and being at boat shows. That's always the funny question that everyone seems to ask at a boat show, where they don't really always understand what that means and the impact it has. So
good choice of words.
Yes, I'm trying to be politically correct as much as I can. What's the biggest myth about Deadrise?
That only transom Deadrise matters.
Okay.
And the reality is, and back to your reference to boat shows, the customer will come up and perhaps they're proud they know Deadrise and kind of know what it means. And they'll ask the salesperson, how much Deadrise does she have? And the guy or the gal says 20 degrees, meaning the transom Deadrise all the way back aft. And then they say, well, my rejoinder is, well, and how about them cup holders? They go right on to a different subject, which is completely almost immaterial. But so Deadrise, first of all, is the angle, looking at the boat like you slice it up like a loaf of bread, across what we call in section. It's the angle of the bottom of the boat, the V, and it can be really sharp or it can be all the way to flat. So what you want is the distribution, in other words, the V from the transom all the way to the bow, or from the bow to the transom, however you want to walk through a boat design, is very important. You see a lot of boats that have the same Deadrise at the transom all the way up to the middle of the boat. Then very quickly it'll pick up Deadrise so the bow is fairly fine and cuts through the waves. And I'll say, so that we can have a conversation over over a sandwich and we don't have to draw pictures on napkins. But a boat is divided up into 11 actually stations or sections. It starts with 0 through 10, 10 being the transom, 0 being at the design waterline, wherever the bow of the boat touches the water, that's station 0. Then you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I can say at station 5, you know where I am, where I'm talking about, okay?
Yep, so, right in the middle of the loaf.
Right in the middle of the loaf, exactly right. So a lot of boats will have what Lindsay Lord coined as a monohedron, same angle hull, from the transom all the way forward to the middle of the boat, from 10 to 5, station 10 to 5. And then the chines start. The chines are the corners between the sides and the bottom of the boat in a planing hull. It's a hard corner for good reason we can talk about. And then the chines will start to come uphill and come in. So the boat gets narrower and the chines get higher as you get to the bow. But the problem with, unless you're talking about good running center consoles, and for example, in the hunt designs, for example, and usually, oftentimes, there is too much transition from that station 5 up to the bow. What happens is, when you're going 30 knots, the hull is hitting the water back at station 5. You only have 20 degrees of deadrise there. It's going to pound, which is going to limit how fast you can go. And it's going to limit how far you can go in a given day. Or let's say you want to go out fishing 30 miles offshore. You're going to have to go 15 knots, while the well-designed boat's going 30 knots. And while you're both the passengers are subject to the same ride, the same accelerations. So by deadrise distribution, which is what we're getting at, is the deadrise from station 0 to station 10 should be appropriate for that section of the hull. It should be the greatest, the sharpest, and all the way in the bow. But you don't want it to flatten out so much that in a 30-knot boat, all of a sudden you're at 20 degrees by the time you get back to where the waves are actually impacting the hull at 30 knots. So if you think about it in this way, when the boat's going 5 knots down the channel and still in the harbor or whatever speed, no wake speed, the boat's right down in the water. It's in displacement mode. It's displacing the water, and the waves are hitting the hull right in the bow, station 0 to 1, say. And then you get out to the jetties and you start to speed up. Well, planing hull, by definition, when it starts to plane, the bow comes up. And then when it's going fast enough, say for a decently designed boat with moderate bottom loading, the whole boat will start to rise, a rise in the center of gravity of the boat at around, say, 12 to 15 knots, depending on how heavy the boat is in relation to its bottom area. So the waves will now hitting more back at station 3 to 4. Now you're going 20 knots and the boat comes up even more. Now the waves are hitting, I call it a bell curve of wave impact incidence, if you will, because I don't know what else to call it.
Yes.
But the average wave is now hitting the hull further aft as you go faster. Why? Because the boat's rising further and further out of the water. So by the time you're going 30 knots, the waves are hitting back in the middle of the hull more than they are in the bow. The bow will hit when it's going, kind of downhill and hits the waves. But this bell curve of wave impact shifts further and further aft. So if you don't have enough deadrise at station 5 and 6 to absorb that, to more incrementally absorb the wave impact, then you're going to have a hard riding boat. It's as simple as that. And why does deadrise matter? Well, when you hit a wave with this hull shape, you're going to hit the wave, you're going to encounter it more incrementally, and you feel that as a smooth ride. If it's flatter, you encounter that wave and the boat stops at the bottom of its cycle more abruptly, and you feel that as pounding. And so it's a direct relationship between the deadrise, where the waves are hitting, and the ride. And now you can think, for every 10 degrees of deadrise you add to the hull at a certain point where the waves are hitting the hull, not at the transom, not the bow, where the waves are hitting the hull, if you add 10 degrees of deadrise, you're cutting accelerations or slamming by 30 to 50%.
Right.
So makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So you can take a handhold that has 5 degrees more deadrise than a lot of boats in this class do, and it's going to have at least, half of 30 to 50% is 15 to, if you want to do some math, 15 to 25% less slamming.
Yeah.
Makes a big difference.
It's a huge difference. Talk about the SEAL teams going out, or compare it with a little bit less importance, running out to the fishing grounds.
Yeah.
Same thing. Like, what is the real world impact in a situation like that of having that proper dead rise? Or even, I think you mentioned too, that impacts maybe the size boat that you actually do need.
No, it's a really good point. I mean, now it depends on what your needs are to some extent. I mean, if your typical use of the boat, you got a few people and you want to take out your buddies and there's 3 of you or 4 of you on the boat, you don't need a 40-footer to fit 3 or 4 people. But your typical day offshore is to go out 30 or 40 or 50 miles with 2 or 3 friends, and you want to go fishing. So if you get a boat that runs well, that's 30 feet long, it can run as well as a poorly designed boat that's 40 feet long.
Right.
So why not get the 30-footer that runs as well or better than the 40, in spite of its added displacement, And you can go fishing on a boat that costs a lot less to buy and to maintain and to operate. So that's one advantage. Another one is for, you got two 40-footers. One's a good running boat and one's a not a good running boat. Then you don't have to cancel your long planned weekend, or you're going to Maine, you're taking your boat to Maine for a week on vacation, from August 1st to 8th. You had that planned all year long. Well, if the wind's blowing 3 or 4 of those days and you've got the good running boat, you can probably still get out every day you're there. It won't screw up your vacation. So the limited time that we have to get offshore and these isolated weekends or weeks of vacation where we take our boat or we rent a boat or we whatever, where we home port it, you much more likelihood that you can get out every day when you have a limited time. Another one is once you get out there, you can go farther. You can go to these fishing grounds that are more productive than these fishing grounds. You go 40 miles instead of 20. Another one that people don't think about, perhaps as much as they should, is the impact that these things have on seaworthiness. Now, seaworthiness is the longest and first chapter in my book for a really good reason. Everything else pales by comparison in importance. Seaworthiness we define fundamentally as a vessel's resistance to capsizing and sinking. Okay, but there are other things that determine the seaworthiness of a boat too. One of them is agility. That's another term like traction that I apply to boats as much as I'm a boat guy. Agility is the ability to what? Avoid breaking waves, for example. So you're running along and the wind's honking and you're going 16 knots because that's as fast as you can go. And all of a sudden you see this breaker right over here develop right in front of you. Well, how quickly can the boat turn and accelerate to get away from that breaking wave, because 100 feet over that's not breaking, right? So that's one element. And that breaking wave could sink you, or it could do a lot of damage, or it could injure somebody. So that affects its seaworthiness, its ability to resist capsizing, because you don't want to be beamed to when that wave hits, right? When that breaking wave hits. Another one is, picture this, thought experiment. You're out fishing 40 miles, 80 miles, whatever, offshore fishing, and then the wind starts picking up and you're going home. If you can maintain 25 knots coming home and the other guy's got to slow to 12, which is often the case with single-sized boat, you're home, sipping a margarita for an hour before he does. And meanwhile, the seas are still building while he's out there. So seaworthiness is determined by many things other than vertical center of gravity, meta center, riding arm curve, point of no return, all those elements that you can measure. But if you can get home, if you can avoid big waves locally, breaking waves because of agility, or you can maintain a higher speed coming home, you're more seaworthy. That's the way I look at it. Look at these little jet skis that tow these surfers out in these humongous, 50-foot waves in Hawaii. These little jet skis are extraordinarily seaworthy for their purpose because they're so agile and fast.
There's a lot of great boaters out there that can easily get into trouble. I mean, the prime example, not that they're all great boaters, is like, those Haulover inlet pages.
Oh, right? Yeah, they're great. I love them.
They're fantastic. But I think, too, like there's probably some good captains in there, or could be great and not get in trouble if they had the knowledge and know-how on how to take on some of those conditions that they're in.
Right.
So if we called it Haulover training, how do smart, careful people still get into trouble on the water? Like, what are some of those things that or that you've seen that happen, they don't understand the concepts of? And then maybe even what are some of those things that are not shown in those Haulover videos that contribute to the bad situations that we all love to watch, and be thankful that it's not us being filmed.
Hopefully he doesn't have a big sign saying what his name and phone number is, because he's about to kill his family, right?
Yeah.
As far as Haulover inlet goes, and those are some great, they're very instructive videos.
You would be analyzing them on a completely different level than...
Well, I think I'm going to start doing that, actually, because there's a guy that is a nuclear engineer. He's online. One this morning that I saw was replacing the reactor in the submarine. And about every 4 seconds, he would stop and say, that's not true. And he'd say, because they're being melodramatic about replacing the submarine's nuclear power plant. But I think we can loop that whole discussion of what you see in the Haulover inlet videos back to seaworthiness also. And I'm not going to belabor that point, but I will say there are many boats going out of Haulover inlet that have no business being there. So that bow rider with a droop nose, in other words, by droop nose, I mean the freeboard actually goes down as you go forward. Those are great for lakes and rivers where you have no more than a 6 or 12-inch chop. They're fine. But if you take one of those out where you have waves, especially breaking waves, you have no idea what you're doing, and you shouldn't be out there because you're putting your family at risk.
You call them ladle boats, don't you?
I call them ladle boats because that's what the bow does. It scoops up the water. You get a boat out there, what happens? You get
right conditions. go for it.
Yeah,
right?
on the right conditions,
But,
which means of an enclosed waters where there are no big waves.
There's no chance of the sea.
Although there are big
rise.
wakes.
Yeah.
Now you get a wakeboard boat going on by putting out, I don't know, what are they, 2 or 3 foot wakes, maybe more? They put all that ballast in them. They go at 12 knots, right? They pull a huge wake behind them. And those boats can have the same issues, those little ladle boats. Now, a lot of manufacturers build them. But I think this is one instance where even for a lake boat, they're poorly designed. They're not seaworthy because you can hit a wake from a wakeboard boat and you can flood the forward part. You can put 500 or 1,000 pounds of lake water or seawater in a boat instantly because the bow is so low. And it's all form over function. They think, oh, it looks cool with a bow that sweeps down. But it's insanity because here's what happens in the typical scenario. First of all, the freeboard should increase as you go forward, not decrease, just from a functional seaworthiness perspective. But what happens is usually it's a guy driving the boat and the wife is sitting in the bow. Maybe she's got a couple of little kids with her. The golden retriever is sitting next to her, and then there's a case of beer in the bow of the boat. What's that do? It shifts the center of gravity forward and it puts the bow down and the stern up. So automatically, that droop nose bow is even closer to sea level because of all the weight in the forward end of the boat, in the bow of the boat. And then what happens is you're going along in a precarious situation to start with, and the guy sees a wave or a wake coming at him. What's he do? He chops the throttle. What happens when you chop the throttle in a boat that size? You drop the bow down even further. So you end up with practically zero freeboard. Now, the freeboard is there to keep the ocean out of the boat. We used to say that in the Navy. The hull's there to keep the ocean out of the ship, Mm-hmm. So you've got these combinations of a boat that's inappropriately designed for any kind of rough water or big wakes. And then you have all this weight shifting forward and putting the bow down, immersing the bow even further. And then you have an operator error of chopping the throttle when really he should be hitting it just momentarily just to raise the bow. So that's a compounding problem because once you ship all this water into the boat, now if you're on a Grady White or a Boston Whaler or a boat like that, it's got a deck that's above sea level. It's above the waterline and scuppers. And usually they're not big enough, by the way, but it does have scuppers. And so at some point that water will drain back overboard. The ocean will go back into the ocean, When my boat, when it's rough and I'm in a 30 or 40 foot center console, I'll always run with a transom door open. That's my big scupper. And if I do stuff the bow, open bow boats, dual consoles, center consoles, they're always far more vulnerable than in the open ocean than boats with closed bows. They just are.
Yeah.
I've developed designs for little breakwaters on the bow of the boat, which you can add on to make them far more seaworthy, actually. But it's a vulnerability that you need to be aware of.
Well, so say you are in a seaworthy boat and you have these big seas at Haulover Inlet or wherever it is.
Right.
What are those things that can get people in trouble fast that they aren't aware of as far as maneuvering the boat?
Well, I think what I just alluded to is one thing is local wave avoidance. Because usually you don't have a wave that's 100 feet wide or 150 feet wide that's equally dangerous. You have the center of the breaking wave that you want to stay away from. So first thing is agility. Can you get over where the wave's not so dangerous quickly? You don't see it coming for 5 minutes. Sometimes that wave will start to peak and break, especially when it hits shoal water, almost instantaneously. So you got to be alert at number one, and you have to know what to look for. And this is when you're going out. So we'll talk about coming back in a second. So you want to be able to get over to where the wave's not so dangerous as quickly as possible. You need to understand that when you hit the throttle, the bow comes up. When you cut the throttle, the bow comes down. And so you should use that to your advantage. Like what I'll do if I see a big wave coming and say, holy smokes, this is going to be a problem. So I'll cut the power as it's approaching. And just before it hits, I'll hit the throttle, because if you're already going that speed, you're not going to come up anymore. But if you're going slowly, you slow down, the wave comes, and then 1,000, 2, 1,000, hit the throttle, you can lift the bow up. And that can sometimes help a lot.
That brings you back to your Surfman days, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And it's just common sense. But what have we learned so far? If you're going to go out and you're going to be stupid, or you find yourself in really challenging sea conditions, shift the center of gravity aft. Put the people in the stern, because you want the bow to be up. And I say within reason. You don't want to put everybody back in the stern of a 17-foot boat, but you want to keep that in mind. Keep the trim of the boat, the bow, and be able to keep the bow up as much as you can. The other problem with these little ladle boats is the cockpit is below the waterline. Where does the water drain? If it drains anywhere, it drains to the bilge. And what do you have? You have a 1,200 gallons an hour bilge pump. Now, that's pretty cool, 1,200 gallons an hour. But when you do the math on it, what do you get? You get a fraction of that. 1,200 divided by 60 is 20. So you get 20 gallons a minute out of it. But the problem with a 20-gallon-a-minute bilge pump is that by the time it gets through all the hoses, you're down to 10 or 12 gallons, realistically, over the side. Now, you've just taken 600 gallons of water over the side. Do the math. How long does it take for that little bilge pump? Meanwhile, there's something called free surface effect. You've got a cockpit with 6 inches or a foot of water in it. The water sloshing around does a huge number on stability, and you can easily capsize a boat. So if you do get water over the bow and you've got a cockpit full of water, it's very important to keep the bow directly into the seas because you want to minimize the rolling as much as you can because you can easily capsize with free surface. It has sunk a lot of ships that have been damaged by mines or torpedoes in the war. And if they're rolling, that free surface effect is what actually capsizes the ship.
Right.
So what you want to do is keep the bow into the waves and keep the bow up. So give it, maybe in an outboard powered boat, you're running at 2,000 or 2,500 RPM. Not enough to try to make it plain, but enough to keep the bow up. So now the water is, you're keeping the bow into the waves, which minimizes the rolling, which will kill you, which will swamp the boat. And also, if you have a transom door that's open, even if there's a threshold, a lot of that water will spill out that big door, which is a lot bigger than the scuppers. Then the scuppers have to do the rest of the work.
Right.
So that's something to keep in mind, that those little ladle boats don't drain over the side. That makes them even more vulnerable.
What are some of those things coming back in following sea that you see people get in trouble with? And then how should they think about that? Or what are the few things that they should do differently,
Right.
maybe?
Well, I think, first of all, human nature comes into it a lot. Before we get into the boat handling aspect of it, you have a lot of people that have a lot more pride than ability, especially a guy, right? Like I've taken a lot of couples out on sea trials, and the woman's attitude is much different than the man's. The woman's sensible and observant, and she's always concerned about her family's safety. So she's listening to what I'm saying. And I always talk to the guy like he knows as much or more than I do about boats, so that you're not being pedantic and he feels like you're not talking down to him. So it's really important, the right attitude when you're teaching them or showing them about a boat.
Yep.
I would say, number one, in terms of coming back in, and the reason I bring up the human nature is because a lot of people don't think they need to pay attention and slow down. A lot of times you do. And when you're coming in to a bar, especially one that you're not that familiar with, you want to slow down and even stop. You want to go to trolling speed and watch what the waves are doing. Study the landscape. I guess it's like going into war and making sure there aren't any snipers around you, because these waves can be killers too, So hang out there a few hundred yards, quarter of a mile, half a mile, and study for 5 minutes what the wave pattern is. And they usually go in patterns. Maybe you used to talk about every seventh wave being the biggest, and sometimes that's true. Same thing with a bar. You're coming in, you can, well, over here, they're breaking a lot. And over here, it's pretty safe, That's because of the configuration of the bottom, the topography. You can subject yourself and your boat and your passengers to a lot less danger by slowing down, paying attention, and watching. The other thing is, what are the other boats doing? Maybe you see some boats that look like lobster boats, and they're in and out every day. Well, they're probably going in the right spot.
They may know a thing or two.
They probably know what they're doing, So anybody that looks like a local or a charter boat, pay attention to what they're doing. That also bears on deadrise distribution, because a lot of boats could be way too fine in the bow. I can think of some center consoles that the bow is they're great head sea boats, like a destroyer bow. But when you're going with the seas, when you start going down the back of a wave or the front of a wave into the trough, and when the bow gets to the trough of the wave, the bottom of the wave, it keeps going and going and going like a submarine, right? Because there's not enough either buoyancy or dynamic lift. That's the lift from the water flow going past you. And so what you want to do is get the bow up as much as possible. If you have the trim tabs down as you're coming in, put them all the way up, or the interceptors, or turn them off, because you want the bow to be up as much as you can when you're going in a following or a quartering sea. Watch the waves, study the pattern, go in the most benign conditions possible, and then match if you can do it. Don't try to be a hero. And once again, human nature. Don't try to come in at 40 knots when the waves are doing 15 knots, right? The waves are doing 15 knots. You should stay on the front of the wave, also doing 15 knots as much as you can. Try to ride that wave all the way in. You won't be a hero, but you'll be the smartest guy in the line of boats.
Yep.
Put your ego aside. Don't try to look like, a Sopwith camel pilot, The person who takes his time and isn't trying to show off and does a good job handling the boat stays calm, and everybody else does too.
Yeah. Good advice. We need to make that more public.
Yeah, no. We're covering a lot of ground here because my mind goes in all kinds of different directions,
Well, you have so much in there.
From surf to docking, you know?
If someone was to go on a sea trial, they were interested in a boat, and they're going on a sea trial, if you had a checklist of 5 things that...
I do.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
That's a really great question too, because that's really the way to think about it. So I'm walking down the dock. How easy is it to get on the boat? Before you even get on it. Does it have a side door? Is the side door, can you open it from the dock? Can you walk through it easily? And I would also look at the stern of the boat and see if I fell overboard and by myself, and hopefully the engine's in neutral and not in gear, could I get back on it unassisted? So unassisted boarding. Is there a ladder? how long is the ladder? Is it 3 steps or 4? Is it 11 or 15 inches wide? If it's 15 inches and 4 steps, even an old guy or old gal can get on the boat pretty easily. Is there something to hold on to at the top? You can get a really good idea how a boat's going to ride by the chine elevation. The chine, remember, is the hard corner between the side of the boat and the bottom. And if that chine comes out of the water, we're walking forward now. So it's immersed. It's underwater at the stern, almost every boat. Maybe some of the early hunts weren't. And then at some point, the chines are at the waterline and they rise above the waterline as you go forward. They call that the chine immersion point, right? At what point do the chines go underwater? If that immersion point is up at station 2, all the way in the bow of the boat, it's going to be a hard riding wet boat. You're almost guaranteed, because here's the Deadrise again, and my knuckles are the chines. The higher the knuckles are at that given station, the more Deadrise there is right there.
Right.
So if I have, and that generally speaking, because your keel is going to be about the same depth underwater. So if I see a boat that the chines go underwater almost all the way at the bow, I know it's going to be a hard ride because there's very little Deadrise. The angle of entry, like a fish looking up at the boat, is going to be like this instead of like this.
Yeah, wide instead of narrow.
Exactly. And the boat that's got too fine an entry is the one that you don't want to be in going down sea because it'll bury. There's not enough lift or buoyancy to keep it up. Moderation and all things Aristotle teaches us, right? Yes. So you want to get that right. It takes me a while to say this now.
Yeah.
But I would look at the chine elevation on the boat on a hunt design Grady White. If you look at one of their big center consoles, the chine goes in the water back at station 5 or even further aft. That tells me there's a lot of Deadrise in the forward half of that hull.
Right.
And it's going to be a good ride because you have so much Deadrise in the bow of the boat.
Yep.
Another thing is, what's the height of the cockpit deck in relation to the waterline or sea level, if you will? If it's like 2 inches above the waterline, I'm thinking this is not a seaworthy boat. Because if I do take that water over the bow or I put a lot of people in and weight and maybe a tuna fish in the boat, the deck is going to be down at or below the waterline, which you do see on these boats that have big scuppers. Well, scuppers work in both directions. They can bring the boat in, they can bring the water into the boat, or they can drain it out. So the height of the deck is important. I'll just throw out a number. If it's a 30-foot boat, I'd want to see at least 6 inches of deck height above the waterline. That translates into reserve buoyancy. And so there are rules of thumb that you can use. Another thing I'd look for are the cleats. Do I have enough cleats? Like I always want a side cleat that I can reach from the cockpit, and I want another side cleat that I can use forward as a bow line if I'm fueling the boat up, right? Rather than having to reach the bow. So these are the kind of the things that I'm looking at. And then I get on the boat and I look at the colors. If it's a bright white interior, it's not my boat, because the bright white interior, we've already talked about glare at night, and it also causes eye strain in bright sunlight. So you have to wear sunglasses. And even then, for me, it's not my cup of tea. Another one, does it have an open transom? If it has an outboard powered boat, it has an open transom. In other words, there's nothing stopping a wave from getting from the ocean into your boat. That's a big down check. And if it does have an open motor well, is there a wall or a bulkhead in the front that prevents the water from going into the motor well and then into the boat? So these are the things that I look at, and they've touched on seaworthiness as well as functionality for the crew. And I go up to the helm and I look around and I see, well, is the steering wheel and the throttle, are they, sensibly placed? And can my 4-year-old hit the throttles or, do something that's going to cause problems? And then I look, visibility. I look at the bow of the boat, what's the freeboard look like? How seaworthy is this boat? And then, we'd start the engines up. I'd look and see, what kind of engines, how far apart are they? If you look at outboards, the further apart the outboards are, if it's a triple, that tells you how much authority you're going to have when you're either twisting the boat manually to maneuver it, or you're using a joystick, like a Mercury or a Yamaha joystick control. The further apart the engines are, the more couple or more force times distance you have, and the more the boat, the better it will move sideways when the engines are opposed, and the quicker it will twist. Just the thought experiment I use, Steve, is if you're in a swimming pool at the shallow end and you've got an 8-foot dinghy in front of you, and you grab that dinghy at the transom and your hands are a foot apart. Now somebody says, turn it 30 degrees to the right, and imagine how much force you have to exert to get that boat to turn.
Yep.
And then now move your hands like this and do the same thing. Your force times distance is greatly amplified. And that's exactly what happens with engines, whether it's a Viking inboard or a Yamaha or Mercury outboard. That's how much authority or couple or force times distance that you have. So that's very important.
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. So those are all things that are going through my mind. I'm not usually talking about it like I am, but I'll tell you what's going through my mind.
I appreciate that.
Another thing is when I'm sitting down or if I'm standing, is the windshield frame right at my eye level? Because a lot of boats, it'll be right in front of you when you're sitting down or standing, but can I drive this boat and look through glass and not at a 3-inch wide aluminum or wood frame.
Right.
So that's really important. And
Okay.
I can't do anything about it other than take a sledgehammer to the windshield. But I will take that into advisement when I decide whether or not to buy this boat or recommend. I do a lot of work with people that are buying boats. And that's one thing I said, this is a problem with this boat. But if you like everything else and you can live around this, you can work around this, then that's fine.
Right.
Okay, so then we cast off. We get the boat underway. Of course, I check the fuel level, and you hook the little cord up to your belt to make sure the engines will shut off if you fall overboard or walk away from the helm. Make sure everybody's where they should be. And I always tell people before I do something, okay, we're going to cast off. The little kids, older people, the landlubbers sit down, and 1 or 2 people are handling lines, and they know what they're doing, or I tell them in advance what they're going to do. Cast off, the bow line, and then the stern line, whichever way, depending on how I'm going to maneuver. Then you get out to the jetties. Say you're in a harbor with jetties, and then you say, okay, we're going to speed up. Everybody ready? So I'll just say something like that. They'll know we're about to accelerate. You don't just hit the throttles, right? You warn everybody, and especially with an outboard powered boat. They have such powerful acceleration. And then if it's an outboard, once again, I trim the engines in all the way. So an outboard engine will go all the way down. We'll call, trim them in or tuck them in. So the propeller is actually at a 5-degree angle downhill, if you will. They're pushing the stern up. And then as you accelerate onto plane, that's what you want initially. You want the engines all the way in. When you hit the throttles, it's not only pushing the boat forward, but it's pushing the stern up. That gives you a boost, so you get up on plane more easily. And it also keeps the propellers from ventilating. But people call that cavitating. No, that's not as ventilating. Whenever the propeller pulls air in, atmospheric air in, because the propeller is too close to the surface, the leading edge of the propeller is under a vacuum. It's under low pressure because it's pulling the water. The trailing edge of the propeller is pushing it. It's under high pressure. And as it goes from low pressure to high pressure, it creates cavitation bubbles. But if the propeller gets too close to the surface, that low pressure will draw an atmosphere and the engine will ventilate, and it'll rev up and you'll lose thrust. Okay, that's another aside, a little sidebar. Yeah. So I make sure the engine's tucked all the way in, and I accelerate onto plane. So we have the engine, and once again, outboards. With a convertible, obviously an inboard, all you got to do is advance the throttles. Now, on a poorly designed inboard that's too stern heavy, or it got too much fuel in it or too much weight aft, then you might want to use the interceptors or the tabs. Interceptors are little gates that drop down and develop lift. They have a higher lift to drag ratio than a trim tab does, but the trim tab works better at low speed, more lift initially. So anyway, another sidebar on that. With the outboard, the engines are tucked all the way in. They're pushing uphill at 5 degrees or so. And then as you gain speed, once you get up on plane, it could be anywhere from 15 to 20 knots. We'll talk about minimum planing speed in a second too. Then you start to trim the engines out. Why is that? Because now you're going fast enough that the dynamic force of the water flow under the hull is holding the hull up. Not buoyancy, now it's dynamic lift. So once you get to that point, call it 20 knots to be safe. Then you can start to trim the engines out. And what that does is that starts to push the bow down. And since the hull is just a big teeter-totter, as the stern goes down, the bow comes up. And that's what you want, to a point. And why is that? Because the more the hull is not in contact with the water, you've reduced the frictional drag, the drag of the water against the hull surface, and the boat will go faster. And usually, with outboards, it's usually around, out of 10 bars of engine trim, usually around 5 bars at 25 or 30 knots is your sweet spot, usually. And you can play with it. And what I do is I trim the engines out. If it's a boat I haven't run before, I get up to 30 knots, say 4,500 RPM, and I trim the engines out until they start to ventilate. And then I go back in for a second or two. Okay. That's usually the sweet spot. Yeah. Because you've got the bow as high as you can, the stern as low as you can, and that's where you have the least amount of drag. So the other kind of drag besides frictional drag, which is driven by the hull surface in contact with the water, is form drag. That's what shows up in your wake. That's the water you're displacing out of the way. It's called form drag. And that's the hull, it's the propellers, it's the shafts, it's the rudders if you have those too. So then I trim the engines out as far as I can until they start to ventilate, and then I tuck them back in a little bit.
When you get on plane, then what's the next step?
And when you're on plane, the definition of that is you have a vertical rise in the center of gravity of the boat. You don't just have the bow coming up. Now you go over your bow wave. You've driven over your bow wave. If you have a ship, which is a displacement hull, all it can do is displace the water. It's not shaped to come up on the top of the water and plane. It's shaped to go through it with minimal resistance. So if you have a ship or a displacement vessel is limited by the speed of an open ocean wave of the same length. You have a 100-foot wave in the open ocean. It's going to go the square root of its length times 1.34 for all you nerds out there. So that means that 100-foot wave is going to go 13.4 knots all day long in the open ocean. When it gets into shallower water, it's gonna slow down, But when you're in open ocean, now a planing hull is designed to go over your bow wave. It can go faster than an open ocean wave of the same length as the bottom of your boat, the waterline length of your boat. So that's what planing means.
Yep.
So you get up on plane and then you trim it out. And then remember now, if you got those engines trimmed out all the way and then just tuck them back in after they start to ventilate and you're on your sweet spot, now everybody says, oh, it's a beautiful day. Let's go up in the bow. So now you shifted 1,000 pounds of people in a 30-foot boat into the bow. Now maybe your engine will start to ventilate again because you put so you might have to tuck them in a little bit, just as an aside.
If there's one sea trial move that tells you if a boat is good or not, what would that be, and what are you watching for and feeling for?
The number one thing is whether a boat will hook or not. Okay, and by hooking, I mean you put it in a hard turn, or maybe not so hard a turn with some boats, and all of a sudden the stern will slide out from underneath you. And that can be a really bad day. If you say, if you're a guy and your wife and your child are sitting in the stern of the boat and you think this will be, or your 15-year-old's driving the boat and he puts the wheel hard over or even partially over, and all of a sudden the stern will spin out on you. And it took me a while to figure out why it does that. And I always looked at the stern. I'll say, well, the stern of this boat and the stern of that boat are the same. Why is this one hooking and this one's not? It's usually the bow of the boat that makes it happen. And that's because the bow will turn into a rudder if it's too much dead rise and it's too steep and it's too low in relation, and the trim of the boat is too low. In other words, the bow is down too much. If it comes to a point, all of a sudden the bow will catch, and the distance from the propellers to the center of resistance of the hull increases, because when you put a boat in a turn, not only do the propellers push forward, now they're pushing to the side, and when it heels over, now the propellers are pushing up as well. So the trim changes. So when you push the stern up, the bow comes down, and if that bow grips, because it's got a sharp keel, and you've got a lot of weight in the bow of the boat, all of a sudden it'll just spin out on you. The bow will become the fulcrum instead of the pivot point becoming the fulcrum.
Bad day.
Bad day. And it can kill. It has killed people. I've worked on cases before, especially some, in my experience, step bottoms have hooked. And a step bottom, if I can make a quick comment about that, there are people like Michael Peters and Rob Cady, I think, who've done a great job of fixing these inherent flaws in the step bottom. They make them so they're safe, but other are not so well designed. And a step bottom tends to run flatter because of the pressure points. There's 3 pressure points, concentrated step, transom. And so they tend to run flatter. They're not as susceptible to adjusting trim. But if the intakes into the cutouts and the chines are not big enough, high enough, then the airflow is cut off to that step. What happens? All of a sudden you've developed a vacuum. You don't have airflow anymore, and all of a sudden that airflow is cut off. Then that vacuum on that inboard side of the turn can cause the hull to spin out, because all of a sudden you're stopping one side and the other keeps going. That's what can cause a hook. So as another footnote, if you have a really big cutout, then the chances of that happening are greatly diminished. And also if you do some fancy things in the back of the boat, in the stern of the boat, underneath at the bottom, to make it more directionally stable, that helps. And these guys have figured that out. But what happens is you put up a step bottom in a hard turn, and if it's overloaded, and if you have a high center of gravity, you have people up in the tower on a step bottom boat, which I would not do. Now you're increasing the chances of immersing that pocket at the step and cutting off the airflow and the boat hooking. High bottom loading, a lot of weight, and a lot of CG at the top going up, rising CG will make the boat heel more and increase the chance. So that's just another sidebar in step bottoms. Now, here's another thing that I do with sea trials. When you're in calm water, if you put the boat in a turn and somebody's eyes are closed, they should know they're in a turn. It should be like an airplane or a bicycle. I call it a true turn. I don't know if that's my original term or not. But if you're on your bicycle and you're riding around a corner, you don't think about, I'm going to lean over at 17 degrees. Your body just naturally knows that for this speed and this turn rate, I've got to be at this angle or I'm going to fall over one way or the other, right? Same thing with an airplane. If you get up in an airplane, you have to go to the restroom, and you stand up and you're walking down the aisle. If the pilot puts the plane in a turn, banks into a turn, if you know that he's done it, you're probably about to die because you're about to go into a spin. Yep. You can't feel that turn because centrifugal force goes right through your feet. It has to be commensurate with the heel angle of the boat or the airplane or the bicycle. It has to be directly related to or correspond with the turn rate and the speed. So the centrifugal force is at right angles to the turn, to the forces of the turn. And what is the relevance of that? Relevance. It's like the 8-inch cleat versus a 6-inch. With 8-inch cleat, you can put a round turn and a figure 8 and a half inch on it. With a turn, if you're 15-year-olds driving or a guy's driving who puts the wheel over hard, it's going to be a non-event because two things are not going to happen. You're not going to get thrown to one side because of centrifugal force. That force of that turn centrifugal force will go right down through your feet or your butt into the seat or whatever your position you're in, and it's going to be a non-event. It's going to be a safer boat. Boat with excessive dead rise, like a really high dead rise boat at the stern, will heel more. A lot of times a flat bottom boat will heel less, but that sweet spot, like around 20 degrees of transom dead rise, is a pretty good number for a 30-knot boat.
Yeah.
And that contributes to a true turn.
Okay.
Another thing that's not going to happen with in a sea trial, so that's one thing I look for. Then the extreme version of that is put the boat 4,500 RPM, 30 knots or so, and put the wheel hard over, and you warn people in advance. If the boat hooks, I wouldn't buy the boat, flat out. If it does hook. If it doesn't hook, they get a huge upcheck. Because those two things, being on balance in a moderate turn, a true turn, and not being susceptible to hooking, two huge upchecks for me.
Right.
Another one, and you mentioned it earlier, coming up on plane, we talked about visibility, but if you're sitting at the helm and you come up on plane with the engines tucked all the way in and an outboard or whatever boat you're in, if you lose the horizon below the bow, that's hazardous because you can't see ahead of the boat. Now, if you lose it for 3 seconds as you're coming up on plane, well, that's still a problem. I always look to see, and that's another reason to trim the engines all the way in and outboard. You never want to lose the horizon under the bow as you're coming up on plane.
Major safety thing, yeah.
Yeah, but maybe if you stand up, you can see. So that's a good reason to stand up while you're coming up on plane too.
Okay.
So, and then once you're up on plane, going along without tabs, just the hull, doing this thing hydrodynamically, you should be able to sit down and see green water or blue water in front of the boat. If you see a pulpit obstructing the horizon or part of the bow, I wouldn't buy the boat. Because you're just taking up, there's a swimmer in front of you. You can't see him at 1,000 yards, but you could see him at 200 yards when you're about to hit him.
Yeah.
If you were high enough and you didn't have that obscured horizon. So you're talking about what are some showstoppers? Those are showstoppers. Hooking, not being a true turn could be a showstopper. Hooking certainly is. Visibility over the bow.
And the accessibility back of the dock is a big thing.
Very much so, because you can get injured. If you fall overboard, you're by yourself. First of all, never go back to the cockpit when you're by yourself with the engines in gear. That's how a lot of guys are found with their flies down because they're taking a leak back in the stern and they fall over and they can't get back on the boat because they're still in gear. I mean, that's what happens when they find these guys, right?
Yeah.
Always take the engine out of gear. Always shut the engine off when you get to the dock because your 6-year-old might think, oh, this will be cool if they hit the throttle. That happened to me once. I backed the boat into a slip. This is when David's 40 now, so he was about 8 years old, a long time ago. And I went back to the back of the boat to tie it up to the back end slip, and he hit the throttle.
What happened?
It was exciting. His babysitter, who was a neighbor's kid, 14 years old, I yelled at her. She's going across this small harbor, and I said, to get the throttle and pull it back. Meanwhile, it's a 40-knot boat.
Yeah.
And so anyway, she pulls the throttle back and
turns
it around. I could talk her through how to get back to the dock. But ever since then, I've always shut the engines off.
Going to say that would definitely change your perspective on what's important experiencing something like that.
And I should have shut it off at this time. So I've screwed up so many times. If I know anything, it's because I've made so many mistakes, and sometimes 2 or 3 times before I get it.
Learners,
yeah. Another thing I would look at, Steve, what's really important is in the bow of we have a lot of bow riders, right? Either center consoles or dual consoles, typically. I would look for handholds because the bow is not only the most fun place to be, but it's the most active in terms of accelerations. It's moving around the most. So I would pay a lot. That boat with the China immersion at Station 2, I know it's going to run hard. Automatically, I would not buy that boat. Not only because the speed that we can go is going to be very limited, but also because everybody likes to ride the bow of the boat. And if you have a hard riding boat, nobody's going to be able to be up there when you're going 25 or 30 knots. You have to slow to 12. And then it's going to be wet and it's not going to be fun. There are many boats out there. I talked about working with Grady for years. Many of their direct competitors I would not buy because the boats run hard and they're open bow boats. And no matter what position you're seated in the bow, is there something you can hold on to? Do the side rails go all the way across the front? I would want that too. So I'd want something that is easy to reach. Now, ideally, those handholds would be not only there, but positioned at the right angle. Think about when you're doing seated rows at the gym. When you're sitting down and you're pulling the weights and you're trying to do 200 pounds or a heavy weight, whatever that is, you're not going to hold them up like this, and you're not going to hold them like this. You're going to hold them right at this angle and at this, think about that, because that's really where you want the handholds to be throughout the boat, because that's where you have the greatest strength. So that's another quick aside.
I guess far enough back where you can get to where you need to go if the boat's underway and you need to move back from the bow, far enough back where you always have something to grab onto.
That's a great point. So not only having enough handholds and they're at the right angle, hopefully, and the right height and everything else, And I've seen boat builders that have paid attention to that, to their credit. But also, can you go from the bow to the stern and have something to hang on to all the way back? It's continuity of handholds and combination of railings and handholds. Continuity is another thing I definitely look for, and that's something I've talked to a lot of people about.
Yeah.
Another thing is just what's the coaming height in the cockpit? There are some center consoles or saltwater boats, let alone freshwater boats. The coaming mean the height of the boat on the inside of the cockpit, the rail, 24 inches. Now you look at where 24 inches hits your leg. I'm 6'3", or I used to be. And this just above my knee. Yeah, gravity has its way with you after a while. And then look at the difference between 24, 26, and 28 inches on your leg sometime.
Yep.
And think about that point. If it's 30 inches, that becomes the fulcrum that is keeping you on the boat or letting you fall overboard.
Oh, out fishing, I mean, you notice the difference for sure, too, while
Instantly.
you're leaning against it. Yeah.
Yeah. Sailfish is a brand, has a lot of center consoles with a 30-inch railing height, which I think is great, because now it's up at my thigh. So the chances of momentum and inertia making me fall overboard, sending me overboard, is much diminished, because the distance from my foot to my thigh at 30 inches is much greater percentage. Now, your center of gravity is your belly button, most people. That's why on a Coast Guard approved vessel, the railing height is 1 meter or 39 inches. And that point is right about at your center of gravity, a little above it for a lot of people.
Ultimate safety.
While
you're out doing that.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's going to be, you're going to have to work to fall overboard with a 39-inch railing.
Yeah.
But you're not going to have to work with a 24. You're going to work more with a 20. So the higher it is, the more safe it is. And the other thing to look at besides railing height, is there a toe kick space? If you have a toe kick space, which is created either by an actual toe kick at floor level, or by having the railing of the boat stick out further than your liner on the inside, then you can stand upright with your thigh against the railing, but your toe is in.
Yep.
And you're standing straight up, and you're not leaning.
You're latched on.
Yeah, you're latched on, but also you're standing upright, your toe is all the way in, and your thigh is touching the coaming. You see what I mean?
Yeah, the extra indent.
So it makes a huge difference in your balance.
Unless you have a size 16 shoe, then you're kind of
That helps. Yeah. Or huge thighs, I guess, one or the other. So I look for this toe kick. I look for the railing height, and especially across the stern is actually oftentimes ignored, especially around the transom door. A lot of boats will have a transom door that there's just a vertical surface. There's no coaming. There's no bolster on there, or it's not constructed so that there's a toe kick. When you accelerate, that you're under the greatest G-forces, and the biggest opportunity, the greatest chance of going overboard is at the transom, the back of the boat. So if you have this toe kick, it's much more safe. So I think about all the people, my family, my kids, my grandkids, and especially people that aren't used to be on boats. You want to make the boats as injury-proof or as safe as possible by paying attention to these details. Another one, non-skid. Some boats have virtually no non-skid. Really easy to slip on, especially if you're fishing and there's fish guts on the blood on the deck. All things to consider.
Yeah, I love that. Those are all those small things that I think make a big difference. And the reality is, like, all those things do work together to contribute to your overall enjoyment in buying the boat.
And then you divide that into showstoppers.
Yeah.
I've worked with clients before. It's 50, 60, 70-foot boats, and nice boat, but you can fall overboard real easy. Well, for $500, you can get a railing added. You see what I mean? So you can improve a lot of these things too, just by getting the builder to say, well, often they'll tell me, I agree, and I'm going to do it all going forward, or they can smile and do it because they want to sell the boat, but they will do it to make these smaller improvements. Now, if they have a 12-inch wide corner post you can't see through, that's a showstopper.
Right.
You got a boat that hooks in a turn, it's a showstopper. You got a boat that's too little freeboard in the bow, and you're going to take it offshore, it's a showstopper.
Right.
Yeah.
Some rapid fire questions for you are always good.
Rapid fire?
I like these last time.
And see if I'm still awake.
I made some new ones. Yeah. So first thing that comes to mind, best handling production boat you've ever driven?
Because the steering is equal on all the boats, any of the Hunt designs. One of the reasons I like to be here, at this point, I really understand hulls really well, because I've spent a lot of time paying attention to them, and they just run better. That balance and Deadrise, the other features that Hunt has asked me not to talk about, but they just run so well.
How about the worst?
I'll say Carver is one of them. Galleon is one of them. What they share in common is a hull shape that's not, or meridian. They're not designed to go to sea. They're designed to stay in the intercoastal. They're too fat and flat forward. They're wet. Those two go together, by the way. A fat, flat bow will not only pound and slow you down in any kind of, even a moderate seaway, but you look at the spray pattern. Look at a video. They're online. The spray pattern, because it's a fat bow, goes forward, it throws the spray forward, and then it goes up over the boat. It's a constant torrent of spray.
Yeah.
And that's another thing we haven't really talked about, but the spray makes the boat not only uncomfortable, but dangerous because you can't see through it.
Right.
The windshield wipers are fighting it all the time.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's all kinds of boats in that category that are just too fat in the bow.
One feature you never want to see on a boat again.
Boarding ladders that are too short or non-existent, or that are down in the center console, and when you can't reach them, it's a life or death issue.
Favorite sea trial conditions: flat, calm, light chop, or nasty?
My favorite would be all three, because I want to see how the boat handles in benign conditions. You know, how does it respond? It's like we talked about the outboard separation and the propeller size, the gear ratio. So the drivetrain, you can tell some things about it at the dock, in the marina, backing into a slip. In moderate seas, which is usually what you're going to be running in, you have a realistic idea of whether this boat is for you or not. Because if you want to do 25 knots and you find out in 2 to 3 foot seas in a 50-footer, it can't handle it, it's a showstopper. But the other thing is I want to see really rough water, because I want to see what the capabilities of the boat are. Yeah. So ideally, I have a harbor, I have an intercoastal waterway or a bay or something with a lee, but I've got 20 knots of wind offshore that I can get around that lee and see how the boat does in 3 to 5s or 4 to 6s.
I think I filmed you in some of that.
Yeah, well, we've been in 8 to 12s off of Sydney Harbor.
I love that footage. That was great. I was soaked, but it was awesome.
It was so fun.
Yeah. Most overused word in boat marketing?
I would probably say, kind of ignorantly used, one would be deadrise. Not understanding the full implications or ramifications of deadrise and deadrise distribution.
What's one spec sheet number you almost always ignore?
Speed, because it's always the top end speed. And once again, it gets you into all kinds of trouble.
There's so many variables, right?
There are variables, but also what does it cruise at? What does it cruise at comfortably? You're not going to run the boat wide open. Doesn't matter what it is. You can hit 40 knots, but it can pound the snot out of you at 20. It doesn't really matter. It gives you maybe a baseline. It'll tell you what it can probably cruise at, because as a percentage,
more important, yeah.
Gas engines, it's probably half that speed. Diesels, it's probably 80% of that speed.
Right. Best inlet you've ever run in for fun?
Well, Hatteras Inlet, where I was a coxswain, the Surfman in the Coast Guard, definitely was a lot of fun. Florida, of course, has got a bunch of them. Another one's not an inlet, but another one that's really gives you a good test is Buzzards Bay in Cape Cod, south of Buzzards Bay, or south of Cape Cod, because when the current's coming out of the north and the wind is invariably out of the southwest, it gives you a real good
testing
washboard,
grounds.
nice testing grounds. But Hatteras Inlet is where I've had the most experience. Towing shrimpers from a 100-foot shrimper with a 44-foot Coast Guard motor lifeboat was a lot of fun. I love that stuff.
Pretty funny.
Yeah.
It's great. What's one thing people should spend more money on their build?
Assuming that you can't change the helm or the visibility and that kind of thing, which are so important, or the hull shape, it might be electronics, so that you have a really good picture. So you can have GPS on one. Like a lot of people with one display, if they're fishing, they'll favor the fish finder. That's
doing a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And they ignore the radar and the GPS. So I'd say get big screens, the biggest ones you can afford, and that will fit on the dash space. So you can have at night or in fog, you can have a really good radar display, and preferably not superimposed over the GPS, because one obscures the other. So preferably you'd have a dedicated radar in fog and night, and another one is just the GPS display, the chart display. So I would.
I like that. What's one thing they could spend less on and still be fine if it was a good boat to start with?
Well, for me, it would be things like decor. I don't care that much a bit, but
you don't want the throw pillows. Yeah.
I don't care about the foo-foo pillows. If it's comfortable and it's a good mattress, but that's a guy's perspective.
Yeah. What's the best simple upgrade an owner can make to improve how the boat feels offshore if it's already starting with a kind of a decent hull?
I would say, and maybe this touches on an earlier question about where can you spend your money, and that's on power. The more power you put in the boat, almost always the better, unless it gets crazy. You're in a 100-mile-an-hour boat. I remember when I was at JD Power and Associates, I started the marine practice there a long time ago, and an underpowered boat always got poor marks. So people that think, I'll get this 20-footer with a 150 instead of the 250 because it's 6,000 less, it's really not a good choice. You never wish you had less horsepower back there. Somebody gets hurt and you want to get back quickly, or you need more power, keep it remember we're talking about getting in the front of a wave coming across an inlet. If you don't have power, you can't do that.
Right.
And also, parenthetically, if you don't have the right reduction gear ratio and the right shaft speed and the right propeller size, you can't do it.
Not getting out of the hole.
And also the rudder. I've seen foil-shaped rudders on 25, 30-knot boats that stall. You got to have the right shape rudder and the right size. So all these things, make sure the drivetrain is right, go with the max power. generally.
What's the most annoying noise on a boat?
Almost always the engines.
We talked about that last night.
I mean, it's insane how loud they are, really. The outboards, if you sit in the back of a boat, you can have 100 dBA. And remember, you can take 84 dBA for 8 hours without hearing loss. But a lot of these boats are 95 or 100 if you're back, especially if you're back in the engines.
Smaller boat.
If you're back there for 8 hours, you're going to have hearing loss, flat out. So I would say if there's a way to make these engines quieter, I'd be all over that. And then with diesels, inboard boats, there's two kinds of noise. There's exhaust and there's radiated noise through the deck from the engines themselves, from the machinery noise, a higher frequency. So the more you can spend on, that's another, I'm kind of changing my answer a little bit here. What would I spend money on a diesel boat? I'd spend it on sound deadening as much as possible.
Yeah.
I'd like to try to get those cruise RPM. What do you constantly cruise at? Say they're a pair of cats or mans and they're cruising at 1900 or 2000 RPM. If you can get those pilot house noise levels down to the 70s, mid 70s, that's really good.
Yeah.
But so much more relaxing. Workload.
Yeah.
Engine noise is a big part of workload. The other thing is the noise coming out the stern, the exhaust noise. You got radiated noise, exhaust noise. You can get that down by having better silencers, better mufflers, but either horizontal or vertical lift. But once again, I defer to somebody like Viking because they've got that. They've broken the code on that. Yeah.
That's awesome. I don't have any more questions for you. I think we talked about a whole lot of stuff.
I don't have any more answers. It's a good thing.
Well, thank you so much for doing this again, Eric. I think you're a very unique person with a lot of wisdom, and it's all founded in like real life experience and knowledge and your passion. Yeah. I think a lot of people can learn a lot from you, and that's why I like to do this, to be able to share that in a different way with people.
Well, thank you so much. I love sharing it with people too.
I know, like at the bar last night, we couldn't take you away from talking to people.
I know. I was being inappropriate by talking to somebody other than the people that I came with, right?
That's right.
But they like boats. What can I say?
You got to spread the love.
That's right.
Yeah. So if anyone listening, you want to hear more about Eric's background and story, go back and listen to episode 6 that he was on before. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely share it with someone who would enjoy it too.
I have a website, SorensenMaritime.com, if you want to learn more about what I do and about my background and what I do now.
And buy the book.
And Sorensen with an E, S-E-N.
Yes.
Otherwise, you won't find me.
Sorensen.
Very good. Thank you.
Good times, Eric. Catch you guys on the next episode.
You betcha.
Awesome.
See you on the water.